Welcome to Thinking Like a Lawyer with your hosts Ellie Mistal and Joe Patrice, talking about legal news and pop culture, all while thinking like a lawyer. Here on Legal Talk Network.
Welcome to another edition of Thinking Like a Lawyer. I'm Joe Patrice from Above the Law. With me is Kathryn Rubino, also of Above the Law, joining us because Ellie Mistal is out again this week. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm getting used to being part of the Thinking Like a Lawyer cast here.
Yeah, you're kind of officially the villain.
Are we whispering now?
We should do this whole episode as an ASM or whatever. Is that AS? Is that what is that? I don't even know what it is.
Like that.
Yeah, do that. Yeah, no, let's not do any of that.
I have the nails for it.
Yeah, no, let's do none of this.
It's a little creepy. You remember that like Super Bowl commercial they had about that? It was like
with the beer,
Zoe Kravitz, and she was all like,
"Yeah,
it's really creepy."
Yeah,
it's not something I really want to watch like with my like mom during a football game either.
Right? Yeah, but
it's a little weird.
Yeah. But we could become the first ever legal podcast that goes all the way through whispering and clinking bottles.
That'd be something, let me tell you.
Yeah, no, let's do none.
No, you don't like it?
Yeah,
Okay.
Put an end to it.
Okay,
so we've accomplished what we're not going to do today. What are we going to talk about today?
I thought we'd go through some hot topics.
Okay, this is becoming our go-to. For those of you who think that this is just kind of a lazy device that Kathryn and I have for whenever Ellie emergency disappears and she is called in to be the guest host, then you're totally right.
Yay.
That is absolutely what this is. And so you get to be regaled by our discussing the hot legal topics that we've been covering over the last few days.
Well, one of the biggest hot legal topics of the last couple days, weeks, is Greg Craig, former Skadden counsel, was found not guilty. Mm-hmm. He had been prosecuted as part of the Mueller probe for lying to investigators about whether or not he was a lobbyist.
Right.
So he's all good. Everything's fine and dandy. What's going on there?
So the issue with Greg Craig, for those who weren't following this throughout, is much like a lot of Washington lawyers, Greg Craig made his career by being in government and then immediately turning around and being in the private sector and doing a thing that you would consider lobbying and common sense would consider lobbying, but the law would not consider lobbying because then they wouldn't be allowed to do it. We have a series of regulations that prevent people from lobbying, in particular when they're lobbying on behalf of foreign governments. In this instance, Skadden was hired to produce a report that told the then pro-Russia government of Ukraine that it was okay that they were jailing innocent people.
Yeah.
Political prisoners. Yeah. So he puts together this, which is, designed for the purpose of convincing people that Ukraine's not, run terribly. So that would be, one would say, lobbying on behalf of the Ukraine. However, if you don't do certain things, then you don't count as a lobbyist and you don't have to register as a foreign lobbyist. And Craig's actions, once everything came out, the jury determined that Craig may well have lied to investigators about being a foreign agent, but those lies, to the extent they happened before the statute of limitations period here. And so therefore, after the October 3rd, whatever year date that they had to work with, he did nothing to mislead anyone as far as what he was doing, and so he
that's factually what happens. But yes. I know you've taken a pretty bold stance that it says something bad about the way this system is set up.
Yeah. I mean, the way in which we have people who are lobbyists in all but name as an effort to circumvent any regulation of the activities they do is a bad thing. I understand the need to some extent for a revolving door because
that's how people are willing to work in the government, right? For a certain extent,
Yeah, obviously there are abuses to it. There's some value. Obviously there's expertise that can be brought up and so on. But on the other hand, it leads to some industry capture, which is problematic. Sure. Point is, there's some degree of a revolving door no matter what you do, and there's some perks to it. That said, the way in which people can avoid the regulation is really troubling. I wrote an article about a relatively famous political figure that if I named, you would know. I put in this article that he was working with a lobbying shop because he was on the letterhead of a lobbying shop that they send around when they try to say to clients, hey, look, we have this lobbyist. And I used the small L word, lobbyist. And I got an immediate email from his people saying that it's imperative that we not call him a lobbyist. And I was like, right, because you're not legally able to be a lobbyist. But what you do is lobby people.
So you're a person who lobbies people who is not a lobbyist.
Yeah. And that's a real problem. I think transparency is a good antiseptic. If people were required to call themselves lobbyists, even if it's a little sketchy, we at least could see that that's what they were doing. But right now we have created a world in which we have real penalties for people improperly lobbying and not registering. But we've written them in such a way to allow people to actually do it in the dark. And that's bad.
Yeah, that's worse.
Yeah. And so that was the Greg Craig story. Obviously, one of Craig's associates did plead guilty in this case, but Craig himself has managed to avoid anything, which he should have all along, because what people don't necessarily remember about the procedural posture of all this is that this grew out of the Mueller report because Manafort was the go-between between the Ukrainian government and Craig. And this was much like a lot of Mueller spin-off investigations that weren't directly tied to what he was working on. It went to the SDNY, and the SDNY's U.S. Attorney's Office looked at it and went, yeah, there's nothing here. And it was then picked up by Main Justice we're not going to say that it was a deliberately political attempt to try and make sure that there was a Democrat who got caught up in Mueller stuff, but it was a deliberately political attempt to make sure a Democrat got caught up in Mueller stuff, and it backfired on them.
So next topic, we're post-Labor Day. That means everyone is now back to school. Law schools are all in session.
I'm not wearing white, so...
Congratulations,
Yeah.
Nor should you be. So we're back to school. Everyone's back to law school. And I know you got a lot of play skewering advice columnists who have some advice for law school students. Remember that? But what is your actual advice for... Well, let's talk about the situation first, and then we can actually get into our real-life advice for law school students.
Sure. An advice columnist answered a very, as one might expect,
I'm totally freaking out about law school.
I'm freaking out about law school. It's so much work. Everyone told me it was so much work, but I'm really freaking out in week one. And I gotta say, if you're freaking out in week one of two things is a problem, and both of them are problems that maybe you should consider making a career change over. One is that you are so tightly wound and neurotic that this job is going to cause you some real problems if you don't start to get some perspective on it. Or two, you went to some college that didn't prepare you for the concept of a workload, at which point this profession may be a problem for you unless you get caught up.
I don't think that's entirely fair. I think that the beginning of law school is often, this was a 1L, oftentimes law professors feel the need to deliberately scare new school students, right? They, it's the whole paper chase. Look to one side, look to your left, look to your right, right? They're trying to make it seem like being a lawyer is much harder than it is. I think there's a vested interest for a lot of the people who have achieved a certain level of acclaim in the profession to make it harder, make it seem like what they have done is worthy of the accolades they've received. And so they want to make it seem like it's hard. Law school's very, and it's not to say that it isn't hard or that it, learning to read a case is different.
Sure.
It's certainly something that I can remember, first week of law school being shocked at how long it took me to read a case.
Yeah.
It's like I'm a relatively fast reader, and I was like, I can't even imagine how I couldn't get through these words quicker than this. And obviously that changed, over the 3 years and certainly in my legal career, but that's a real thing. That's not like, oh, you went to a shitty college or, you majored in ceramics, therefore you're not truly prepared to be a lawyer.
Yeah, maybe it was obviously there were they were writing a letter for the audience of getting into an advice column.
Sure.
So maybe it was a little drenched in hyperbole, but the breathless freaking out struck me as though that was probably not where they wanted to be, if they're going to law school. But alas.
So speaking of law schools, a notorious law school recently cut their tuition by something like over 20%. I think it was Cooley. Is that right?
Yeah. So that one of these days, we're gonna have to talk about one of your articles. But for now, I guess I'm still on the hot seat. So the Thomas M. Cooley Law School, which is affiliated now with Western Michigan University, though it remains a private school despite the fact that Western Michigan is a public school. So, whatever. Cooley has a reputation. It's where Michael Cohen went to law school. Ironically, back when he went, it wasn't as dismally considered as it is today. A series of moves happened in the intervening years where they got very desperate about, like a lot of law schools did, about churning some money, and their standards lowered, and they made some questionable decisions, and so they're not considered one of the best law schools out there.
They are not.
They have, however, despite being not a very good law school, they were stuck true to their commitment of charging students as though they were a very good law school. And what they've done recently is reduce their tuition by some 21%. And angry Cooley grads wrote us complaining that we weren't appropriately covering this heroic act, and we don't think it's all that when you overcharge the way that you do, you don't really get brownie points for lowering tuition down to by 21%. Indeed, doing so brought them back to where they were, I believe, something like 6 years ago or something like that. So it's not really a huge deal. It's still very expensive, especially considering the dismal bar passage rate that they have. They have a really bad employment score for people who, one of the ways in which we measure employment in law coming out of law school is whether or not the individual who graduates after a certain number of months is employed in a full-time, long-term job which requires a JD degree. And if we looked at that, they have a pretty bad run. A lot of law schools then juice this by something called JD Advantage, which is where they say, well, this person doesn't have a legal job, but the fact that they have a law degree helped them. That they were hired over other qualified candidates because people were impressed by the law degree, which is probably not true, but it's a way in which they can juice their numbers. And even juicing those numbers, they don't come out very well.
I'm not sure that's just juicing. There are people who attend law schools who are doing it for the quote-unquote flexibility of a legal degree, right?
Sure, but that's not what 30% of people at this school are doing, or whatever the number is. I believe the biggest on-record employer of Cooley Law School grads out of the last couple of years has been Cooley Law School, giving small jobs part-time to make it look like they've got jobs.
It's not the best.
I think that for a while that was certainly true. I guess I shouldn't say for sure that's what's still going on, but that is always something to consider when you're looking at employment numbers, is who's doing the employing, because many law schools
Sure, and I think now they
that.
actually count those separately
Yeah.
as part of the NALP statistics. They keep those kind of cordoned off so you can see what it is. And sometimes there are good jobs that are just happen to be funded. A lot of pro bono or
yes.
not pro bono, but public interest jobs are funded that way because, it's hard to get funding for public interest work sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But again, not necessarily what was going on at all the law schools. Okay, so Neil Gorsuch has written a book, a third book actually. He's written a bunch of them. The latest one is actually styled as a memoir, and it's called A Republic, If You Can Keep It.
Oh.
Yeah. I actually wrote about this a little bit, and the thing that I thought was interesting is he, Neil Gorsuch clerked for Byron White, Justice Byron White,
which is the name of my fantasy football team in the Legal Talk Network Fantasy Football League.
That's really good, and that's actually kind of part of it, right? Because his nickname was Whizzer White. He was a football star back in the day, back in his day, who went on to law school and to have a very formidable legal career, became a justice on the Supreme Court, and Neil Gorsuch clerked for him. And one of the stories kind of in there is about how, Justice White would tell him, history will forget us all, and that's, quote, exactly as it should be. And how, Gorsuch is like, yeah, I guess that's cool. And now how when he goes through the Supreme Court and he sees visitors stopping at Justice White's portrait and they don't know who he is.
Right.
It's just part of the whole history forgets, which is kind of remarkable. Can you even imagine right now a pro athlete who's good at what they do turning around and being a Supreme Court justice?
Sure.
Well, it would be notable, right? Like everyone would still know who that person was.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
In terms of he's not remembered anymore.
Yeah, I mean, White played in an era where the NFL wasn't what the NFL is
sure,
today.
That's fair.
I think.
That's a fair point.
Probably a better corollary is the career of Alan Page, who was on the Minnesota Supreme Court, who people absolutely remembered as a football player too.
Sure.
Though I've heard from people I know who knew him well that he was very, very annoyed when people wanted to talk about the football rather than his legal career.
Sure,
but
and
still.
Reportedly, Justice White did not appreciate being called whizzer towards the end of his legal career. But one of the things I kind of point out too is that Merrick Garland's like, it's fine to be forgotten.
Not Garland.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Yes, you said Merrick Garland because that's the
weird.
person who would sit in that seat.
And that's the exact point that I was trying to make. My head got a little ahead of myself there, but it's going to be impossible to forget Neil Gorsuch. He will always be, at the very least, the answer to a trivia question, because never before were the sort of machinations for a seat so on display as they were when, they refused to even give Garland a hearing.
Yeah, it's got like maybe an Abe Fortas for chief kind of thing, but that's about the only historical corollary I can really think of.
And it's not quite a corollary, right? Because he still was on the court.
Right, though he left after that. But understood. So did you write anything? You have your computer in front of you. Mine is not available because it's recording the podcast. So why don't you talk about something?
Well, I mean, I was.
Okay, good.
That's literally what I did. So apparently there's news to celebrate in the legal academia because MBE scores are up. That's the multi-state bar exam. I think 44 jurisdictions use some form of the MBE as part of the overall exam score. So this doesn't tell us that overall passage rates are up, right? Because it takes forever for for the various state bar organizations to grade the bar exam. So we don't know. No state has as of yet released their passage rates for the July 2019 sitting of the bar exam. But the MBE scores we know are up. It's actually 1.6, I think, points up over last year's mark. So we expect better passage rates as a result. I think the majority of the jurisdictions that use the MBE use it for at least 50% of their overall grade. So that seems like it's good.
Yeah.
And listen, it's good news. And if you took the bar exam and you're worried, oh my gosh, I'm freaking out, did I pass? This is a good sign.
Yeah. No.
But. And this kind of a 1.6 point increase is a lot, but it still doesn't get us back to where we were in 2017. The problem is really that in 2018, there was a giant decrease. It was a 34-year low, and we haven't quite gotten back up to where we were before that dip. So it's hard to say whether or not these are sort of lasting trends that will change the legal industry, but I guess it's good news. And for those who don't remember, the MBE is the multiple choice part of the exam, which,
as you said, is usually around half of the whole exam's score. So.
Right. So, Joe.
Yes.
Somewhat of a mini scandal in Big Law broke today, and I think you wrote about it. A law firm has banned one of their clients from their firm Cafeteria.
Yes. As it turns out, Weil Gotshal had been allowing investment bankers from one of their clients, which also has an office in the same building, to use their cafeteria.
Which is nice.
It's a very nice gesture.
Yeah.
It is, a little weird in that one person quoted in the New York Post's coverage of this said, it's weird to have people from outside the firm in an area of unescorted within an area of the firm where they could get confidential information. But honestly, people go in and out of those cafeterias, clients who are there for the day, opposing counsel who are there for deposition. If people were talking about confidential stuff in that cafeteria, that's a bigger problem. So I don't think it was weird that they were allowing folks to be in there. But the bank and its longtime attorneys are in the middle of a bit of a legal tiff owing to apparently some former bankers at the place were not paid correctly, potentially on advice from Weil Gotshal. And it is something that no one understood until 4 years later after those people had been fired and they sued to get their deferred comp back. It came up in a meeting at Weil that they discovered, according to what's alleged, that Weil attorneys discovered that they'd actually screwed everything up the first time 4 years ago.
Yikes.
And allegedly they responded to this by saying, let's not tell anybody this happened.
Pretty much every legal problem goes away if you ignore it long enough, right?
Right. So
I think that was on the bar exam, right?
That's what's being alleged, and the bank is annoyed about this, as one might expect, because they very well could end up on the hook for this if this is true. And so they've made some threats about firing Weil, and Weil then did, the commensurate thing, which is, well, you can't sit at our table anymore. So.
That sounds about right. Other big legal stories this week. There was an attorney who's a prostitute.
Yes. Well, all attorneys are technically prostitutes, but in this instance, I mean, quite literally.
Yeah, and so I read the story that you wrote about that, and initially I was like, oh, yeah, I guess, that's a thing that happens.
It was a very sex worker positive story.
But
this is a situation unlike some stories in the past where we've had people either in law school or lawyers turn toward sex work, that often those stories are in a narrative of they were forced to because of bills or whatever.
Payments and loans.
In this instance, the woman, Katie Sears in Iowa, had a very kind of sex-positive attitude. She worked in a legal brothel in Nevada. She's been taking time off because she just had a kid. And she just said, it's fine and I can get paid for it. And why not? I find it empowering. And it's like, all right.
Good for her, man.
Cool. Her husband was cited in the article. He said he doesn't really think about it much. And when he was asked why, as it turns out, part of the reason I guess he doesn't think about it all that much is he was in the midst of, unbeknownst to all of us when we reported this story, but hours after the fact, he's been in the midst of a long-running disciplinary complaint that resulted in his license being suspended indefinitely.
So what'd he do?
So there was a DUI. Which is something that unfortunately happens a lot in the legal profession because there are problem drinkers as well as more actually diagnosed substance abuse problems in the profession. He didn't fulfill his obligations under the sentence to go to some of the treatment he was supposed to do, which is bad.
Sure.
He, in addition to being married to Katie, he apparently still hangs out with his ex-wife, and there was a thing where he got a hold of his ex-wife's gun, talked about killing himself. Then she didn't want to give it to him, so he beat her allegedly. And
it took a pretty dark turn there from being a feel-good, sex-positive story.
Yeah, then he, according to the Iowa Supreme Court's opinion, he ultimately got picked up by the police when she called, the ex-wife called, and I guess I shouldn't say ex-wife. I'm not positive if they were married or just ex. They're referring to it as ex. But I think, I think they were. Anyway, whatever. And the police noted that as part of his DUI sentencing, he wasn't supposed to have access to firearms or anything like that. So all of that comes back. He's, convicted of the assault here, and these issues all in addition to him getting supervised release for all of these crimes directly, they're disciplinary issues, and so it went to a disciplinary committee who recommended this, and the Iowa Supreme Court agreed. He has lost his license indefinitely. He can't apply to get it back for another 2 years.
So I'm going to try to lighten the mood here because
Yeah.
that was fairly depressing.
It was.
So I want to ask your advice about something.
Okay.
It's kind of a professionalism question.
You should ask me more professionalism questions. Yes.
Sure.
Oh, wait. Oh, so this is not a visual medium, so they can't see your eyes roll. Go on.
Rolled so hard back into.
Like a great white about to bite down. Yeah?
Should you be using the phrase beautiful tits in an email?
No.
No work emails. Don't use beautiful tits.
Yes. That is...
That's a pretty bright line rule, I think.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. But this is a story about the practice group of the Indiana State Bar sent out if you're in a bar association, you know the drill.
People aren't doing that anymore, really, right? But okay.
No, people send out the little monthly, hey, here's a little whatever.
Sure.
It's part of the community building. And this guy sent out some jokes about grocery stores. And among them was a joke about a woman with beautiful tits, apparently. And that's problematic. The guy, hours after the fact, said that it was wrong and that the joke actually would have worked without that language, and so that's what he should have said, which I feel kind of misses the point because the entire...
I mean, the joke was like something about like the wife...
The guy walks up to a random woman in the store, says, "Can I talk to you for a second?" She says, "Why?" He says, "Because I've lost my wife somewhere in the store, and every time I talk to a woman with beautiful tits like yours, she shows up."
Yeah, so it doesn't really matter. The beautiful tits is just kind of like the cherry on that racism or sexism sundae. Huh?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So he said, "Oh, I shouldn't have said that. I should have just said beautiful woman," which really underscores the doesn't really address. I shouldn't say underscores. Doesn't really address the underlying problem, which is the whole premise of the joke is sexist.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Objectifies women.
Yeah. There's not really. Yeah.
No one's saying don't be entertaining or funny and be lawyers.
Right. Right. The issue is that just wasn't particularly entertaining
or
on
funny.
top of all of the other issues.
Sure. That's also true. But, I'm not saying like ban all humor from bar association listservs.
Oh, no. And I'm afraid that's
going to be the takeaway.
That's the dumb takeaway.
That's the dumb takeaway. But it is, in fact, I think, what a lot of people are going to take away from that.
Yeah. One of the dumbest trends out there are these folks who think that, oh, that joke was offensive, therefore all jokes, I guess, people are going to find offensive. And that's not true. Good jokes don't have to be offensive. You can actually make non-offensive jokes. And in certain settings, offensive jokes do work, right? Like, you could be a professional stand-up comic who's doing things with heavy doses of irony involved.
But that's not a professional listserv.
Yeah, that's not a professional listserv.
Right, and if you are going to be funny or try to be funny, let's be clear, on a professional listserv, then you should probably be pretty careful about the jokes that you make. Yeah. And I don't think that's that hard of a standard to meet.
No, not at all. All right, well...
I was going to talk a little bit about Judge Posner.
Okay.
I know you write about him quite a bit.
Sure.
He retired quite suddenly, actually, from the Seventh Circuit. And when he retired, he started a foundation to do work on behalf of pro se clients.
Helping out pro se clients,
yeah,
yep.
Which is awesome. But then they recently just closed that foundation because there's too many pro se people, which seems like the opposite response that you might want to have. There's such a problem with pro ses. We have to start an organization to help them. Then you get so many pro ses that you're like, fuck it, we're going to shut it all down. Shut it down. I'm going home, taking my ball, going home.
So there are two issues potentially here, and they're both, one or the other is true, probably. But let's just operate under the subject, like either one of these being true says something. On the one hand, it underscores the issue of how access to attorneys has gotten out of hand because of cost overruns. Obviously we know about the crisis of indigent clients, but they may have access to some pro bono help. There's now a situation, given how expensive attorneys are, a whole category of middle-class folks who can't afford lawyers and therefore are locked out of the system as well. And being pro se is having everything against you. You probably are confused by everything that's going on because the legal system tries to make it confusing, which is Judge Posner's underlying point. To that extent, it underscores how bad this problem's gotten that hundreds of people were reaching out to Judge Posner, who, mind you, for pro se litigants are not generally lawyers. These are people reaching out to a federal judge who's a superstar in our little world, but not well known outside of that. So you've got to imagine if there were hundreds reaching out to him, there are thousands more who are facing these issues who didn't even know to try and reach out to him. And that's a concern that we should all take seriously about how the judicial system should adjust to deal with these folks and how law should adjust its whole industry landscape to do that. A flip side to this that was voiced by the executive director of the group was that in actuality, there were opportunities to service a lot of these clients, but that instead, many of the affiliations that the group set up with private practice lawyers to be on their list to help out were really more interested in having their name right next to Judge Posner's than actually doing the work. Yeah. And that many times he was calling people and pulling teeth and telling them, you really need you to help this out, and they wouldn't do it. So that, if it's true, is also indicative of a broad-based problem, because perhaps many of these pro se folks wouldn't need to be there if more attorneys felt that they could operate in a either pro bono or low bono setting where they can sliding scale what they charge to help people out. Anyway,
that's been the week in legal news.
Yeah, I think that's right. Good. So we've kind of, when you're here, we kind of transformed this. We've done different styles. We did kind of the ESPN-y thing for a while. It's like The Economist does their weekly roundup of stories when you're here. So I like that.
Well, if I had more than maybe 6 minutes to think about what we were going to talk about, I could. But
but I like it. I like it. I hope people appreciate that. Another thing that people could do, by the way, is you can write us at tips@abovethelaw.com if you have questions that you'd like us to tackle here, because we've done for the decision before when people are deciding whether to go to law school, but a mailbag episode is always something we would appreciate having, because that would be a perfect instance when we're scrambling at the last minute. Anyway.
So send us your legal questions.
Yeah.
But we're not going to give legal advice.
Right. No, not legal advice, but this would be more like...
about the industry.
Yeah, right.
Or law schools.
Sure. Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So read Above the Law, subscribe to the podcast, review the podcast. That helps us out on the algorithms that tell people how to find legal podcasts. I'm at Joseph Patrice on Twitter. She's at Kathryn1 on Twitter. You should listen to the rest of the offerings of the Legal Talk Network. You should listen to the Jabot, which is Kathryn's podcast that comes out periodically. And I think that's everything I usually say.
Bye.
Cool. Bye.
If you'd like more information about what you've heard today, please visit LegalTalkNetwork.com. You can also find us at AboveTheLaw.com, ATLRedline.com, iTunes, RSS, Twitter, and Facebook. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Legal Talk Network, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.